We will sing, 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 and make music with the heavens. We will sing, sing, sing. Grateful that you hear us when we shout your praise. Lift high the name of Jesus. We will sing, 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 and make music with the heavens. We will sing, sing, sing. Grateful that you hear us when we shout your praise. Lift high the name of Jesus. Love about you, heaven and earth adore you. Take kingdom bow down. Son of God, you are the one. You are the one. You are the light that leads us. Like a fire burning. Son of God, you are the one. You are the one. The splendor of the King. Oh, the majesty. Let all the earth rejoice. Let all the earth rejoice. He wraps still light, and darkness tries to hide. Trembles at his voice, trembles at his voice. How great is our God? Sing with me, how great is our God? Oh, sing how great, how great is our God. Time is here. Sing to me how great is our God. Oh, we'll sing how great, how great is our God. You are worthy of all, and I will sing how great is our God. All day, you are worthy of all praise. I will sing how great is our God. How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. Now let's sing how great is our God. Good morning. I was planning to open with a video this morning, and we somehow we missed that along the way. But the video that I was planning to have on showing was the story, the beginning. Well, it wasn't the beginning. The scene of Braveheart. I don't know how many. I might ask for show of hands because some people maybe you watched that movie. I'm not endorsing everything in the movie. I'm just saying this particular scene. There's an inspiring scene where William Wallace gets up before the army of the Scots, and always before them when they come up, they have run away from the battle. And he's saying, Peter, you're gonna fight. You may not live, but you're gonna live your life so you can have a chance, one chance, to be able to come and have freedom for the rest of your life. Are you willing to fight with me? And everybody's cheering. And so the idea of freedom has been something that has been inspiring and lifting. It's something that people hope for and strive for, and those who don't have it a lot of times wish they had. And unfortunately, a lot of times when people do have it, they take it for granted. Freedom is worth celebrating. This weekend is the birthday of our nation. We celebrated Independence Day yesterday. And so I'm going to focus on some of that as we're in this series on prayer. Today I'm focusing on the prayer for the nation. As we say, we as a people need to pray for our nation. Our memory verse for this sermon series is from Isaiah 43:22. Should be up on the screen. Let's read that together. Yet you have not called on me, O Jacob, but you have become weary of me, O Israel. We talked about how that was God saying to Israel, you guys have not labored in prayer. You haven't come to me. You haven't called me. You haven't asked me for help. I'm willing to come to you. I'm going to do a new thing. I'm going to call people who have never known me before and invite them in. But you haven't called on me. But you have become weary of me. Let's read that together again. Yet you have not called on me, O Jacob, but you have become weary of me, O Israel. As we continue this series of prayer, last week we kind of did an introduction and looked at what Jesus said and the different aspects of the Lord's Prayer, what we call the Lord's Prayer, and how he was teaching his disciples to pray and how he teaches us to pray. We're going to read today from Psalm 33. Let's hear the word of the Lord. The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance. From heaven, the Lord looks down and sees all mankind. From his dwelling place, he watches all who live on the earth. He who forms the hearts of all, who considers everything they do. No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes his strength. A horse is vain hope for deliverance, despite all the great strength it cannot save. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those whose hope is his unfailing love, to deliver them from death and keep them alive in famine. We wait in hope for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we must trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love rest upon us, O Lord, even as we put our hope in you. Heavenly Father, we thank you that our hope is in you, and it is a hope that does not fail. You are always faithful. You cannot deny yourself. Even if we are faithless, you are faithful, because that is your nature. Lord, as we come, we ask that you would bless the reading of this word, the psalmist that wrote so many years ago. We ask that you would open our hearts to receive your truth, your eternal truth from your word. Holy Spirit, speak to us. Help us to hear your words today. In Jesus' name. Amen. The first couple of verses here says, the Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the people. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. The Lord is involved in the plans of nations. Now, for several years of my early life, I thought that really God didn't have thoughts, opinions about politics. I felt like God allowed people. We were in a nation where we chose, we elected, and God said, "All right, you can have what you choose." And I didn't feel like God really got involved. And I began to see some verses, not just this passage, but others, where it talks about God being involved. And as I looked at that, I realized that the Lord is involved in the rising and the falling of nations, considering how he redeemed his people from the land of Babylon. When Judah went off into captivity, where in the history of the world have you had a nation that was taken off into captivity and then gone and then restored? And yet in Israel, it was done. They were taken into captivity for 70 years and restored. And then later in history, they were scattered for hundreds and hundreds of years before in 1948 they were restored again as a nation and had their own political boundaries again, not just identifying as a people, but as a nation itself. God is involved in the plans of the nations.
He caused Cyrus the Great when they were coming back from captivity. Cyrus the Great, a Persian king, a pagan king, a king that saw every god as God. And he said, they're all one. And because he's heard about this one God of the Jews, he feels like if he can bless that God, he can get favor with all the gods, right? And so he pays for the temple of God to be rebuilt. It had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and it was rebuilt in our history. Do you remember the story of George Washington and his escape across the East River when he was in Manhattan? I had to look it up this morning to make sure because I had it wrong. I had it crossing the Delaware, and that was a totally different story. But as you look at this, what happened was Washington had 19,000 troops that were in Manhattan, and they were cornered. And there were 32,000 under General Howe, who was coming in to attack them, to corner them. And there was the opportunity at that point to wipe out the American colonial army in its entirety. They were on this island, and the British fleet, which was the strongest, most powerful fleet in the nation, was supposed to come up and surround them so they couldn't escape off, and they were going to be trapped. And General Howe cornered them. And he knew, he was expecting, he didn't press his advantage. He wasn't going to lose people and troops in the battle. He wasn't going to press that because he believed Washington was smart enough to know they would need to surrender because there was no hope. They were vastly outnumbered. They were cornered. There was nothing they could do. Except the British fleet, the strongest, most powerful navy in the world, couldn't get there. You know why? There was no wind. There was no wind to get the fleet there. The fog came later. There was no fleet to get the wind there, and so they couldn't sail and get to the place of the cutoff point. And that night, under cover of darkness, George Washington was able to get 9,000 of his 17,000 troops off on a lot of different little fishing vessels and other kinds of things across the East River to get them to safety. The problem is, 9,000 is not the entire 17,000. And so there was still another 8,000 troops that were left behind, cornered, when morning came. But then, fog. The fog came in. And it was a thick, soupy fog, and they couldn't see, and they were able to continue getting the rest of the troops across the East River. So when General Howe got there wasn't anybody left. Now, coincidence? Maybe. I don't think so. Something very similar happened in the Battle of Dunkirk in World War II. How they called it the miracle of Dunkirk. There were 336,000 Allied troops, British, French, Allied, all there together. 336,000 troops that were there, cornered, and the Nazis were there with their planes coming in and their artillery, and they knew they had them cornered, and there was no way off. And the British minister prayed and called for the nation of England to pray. And the fishing vessels, there were over 850 fishing vessels that came over, and they started getting these troops off back and forth, and a heavy fog came in again. And the people understood that the fog was an answer to prayer. That's very interesting when you look at the movie Dunkirk that came out, I don't know, 2 years ago, something like that. They completely leave out the whole prayer, the call to prayer of the nation, and they leave out the fog because it makes a much better movie when the planes are coming down. You like my sound effects. They completely leave out the miracle part of that. But this was God's intervention. Without that, over 300,000 troops would have been wiped off, taken captive, unable. There wouldn't have been a chance for the Allies to move forward in victory. And we would have lost the war very early in the war. God was involved. He responded to people. There's just a few examples, but God does listen to people when they pray. God does care about national interests. He's involved in the choosing of leaders for good or for ill. We find in Romans chapter 13 that no authority we have is outside of God's choice. And you say, well, hold on, we've had some really bad leaders. There have been some really evil people in leadership in the world. And there are times that he allows evil people to come in to control, to make people realize they need God and they can't do it on their own. And there are times that we've had bad presidents, whatever your politics. Would you agree we've had some bad presidents? Okay. And yet we as a nation have chosen that. And when we have evil that's in the White House, we can lean on him and realize that he is our king, regardless of who is president. Get an amen on that? Verse 12, the psalmist writes, "Blessed are the people, or the nation, who follow the true God." Our nation has been called a Christian nation, and there were certainly things that were not good in our nation from its founding. But if you look back at some of the things that our founders said, our founders had a very distinct look at who God was. And there are a lot of modern historians that talk about how our founding fathers were deists. They believed that God was the one that was active at one point when he started the world, but he stepped back like a clockmaker and said, all right, the clock is there, it's working, I'm going to let it run. And many people would say that was the way God was. But I want you to listen to some of these quotes of our founding fathers. Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a Pennsylvania doctor and a writer. He was a Presbyterian who began the Philadelphia Bible Society. He said, "I have been alternatively called an aristocrat and a Democrat. I am neither. I am a Christocrat." George Washington said his prayer, "And now, Almighty Father, if it is thy holy will that we shall obtain a place and a name among the nations of the earth, grant that we may be enabled to show our gratitude for thy goodness by our endeavors to fear and obey thee." Of all the dispensations, he continues later on, this is a speech on prayer. Of all the dispensations and habits to which the political prosperity, religion, and morality are indisputable supports, let us with caution indulge in the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. What he's saying here is, if we're saying that morality is important to have in our country to make it go forward, and he says that it is, morality cannot be upheld without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. John Adams, the second president of the United States, said, "Our Constitution was made for only a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." He says later, "Statesmen, my dear sir, may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which the freedom can securely stand." Samuel Adams said this, "We have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven from the rising to the setting of the sun. Let his kingdom come." Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. "God who gave us life, gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God?" John Jay is the first Supreme Court justice. He said, "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is their duty as well as privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." You get that? We have the opportunity to choose, and if we're Christians, he says, you ought to choose a Christian leader. It's our responsibility, he says, our privilege and interest. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, he's also instrumental in the writing of the Constitution. He said, "Whilst we assert ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion we believe to be of divine origin, we cannot deny any equal freedom to those whose minds have not been yielded to the evidence of which has been convinced break this down. We have been given freedom. We also need to give freedom to those who don't believe. If this freedom be abused, it is an offense against God, not against man. To God, therefore, not to men, must an account of it be rendered. We are accountable to God. And if people are not going to respond to him, that's their choice, but they're accountable to him, and it's our place to make sure that we have the freedom available to people. And then Benjamin Franklin, who was not a believer, he was known as the least religious of all the founding fathers. He said this, "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And that if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" He's saying, and I believe that was a quote during the Constitutional Convention, when they were trying to write the Constitution. He's saying, we need God's help. We need God's help, God's intervention. And this is a person who didn't believe in the Bible. He didn't believe, well, he believed in the Bible, he quoted the Bible. He didn't believe in Jesus as the one way of salvation. He didn't trust in him. But he's saying, if we're going to move forward, we've got to have God on our side. We've got to have him work with us. And so even those that are least religious were realizing we are dependent upon God. And if we're going to start as a nation, we got to start as dependent upon him. There are certainly people that were signers of the Declaration of Independence, signers of the Constitution, who were not believers. But there was a strong contingent who were. And our nation began, the freedoms we have began because God intervened in a lot of different ways. Verses 16 through 19, the psalmist indicates that God alone gives salvation. And that's physical salvation, political salvation, and spiritual salvation. It says, no king is saved by the size of his army. The horses, horses were a major tool of battle to be able to have cavalry and be able to run people down. Those are all things. But that is not going to be what saves you. It's God alone that will save you. I was talking with Sister Mershon this week. And we were talking on the phone, and she asked me if I thought that some of the things that were happening in our nation were a wake-up call from God. If God was trying to get our attention. And folks, we have to pay attention. We have to be aware of some of the things that are happening. There's a lot happening in our country right now. The COVID-19 cases are on the rise, and an article I saw late this week is over 40 states that they're on the rise of. There are things that are happening again. The unrest, CHOP, whichever one you look at out in Seattle. There are a lot of things that are happening, and we recognize that we need to intervene. We need to pray. God needs to intervene. And these challenges, as we look in November as the choosing of the next president, how God needs to be our leader. And we need to think through these things and all the things that are going on with COVID-19 and how we're going to vote and all those different kinds of things that are happening. We need to pray. Without God, we can do nothing. There are evils. Let me say this clearly. I'm not saying that our country has a halo over itself. There are evils that we have perpetrated. We have exported pornography around the world, largely. Abortion has been popularized here, and because of some of the policies we've had here, it's also gone overseas, and we have given aid to different people for that purpose. But there are a lot of good things we've done too. Humanitarian aid, help, defense. I do want you to remember that our lives are not weighed out by if the good outweighs the bad, you're good. God calls us to be, as his church, a holy people, a royal priesthood, a people belonging to God. He calls us to conform our image, our minds, our hopes, our plans to him. Christ died for us personally. We also need to realize that our nations have to make right choices too. We need to help be a part of those choices. Finally, in verses 20 to 22, the psalmist concludes, God is our only hope. He says this, we wait and hope for God. He is our help and our shield. In him our hearts rejoice. We trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love rest upon us, O Lord, even as we put our hope in you. Back in Judges, there were some times where the Israelites were, well, they're all of Israel's history, but in Judges it happened several times where the people were turning away from God and not listening to what he was saying. In chapter 2, verse 20, it starts off this way. It says, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. Because the nation. Now, get this with me. Was every person in the nation turned away from God? If they had been, there would not have been any restoration. There would not have ever been a turning back to God. There always is a remnant that God will establish. There's always a people, a select few, even in the worst conditions, there is a people that God will preserve to help the rest be restored whenever there is a fall. I mean, you can look even at Nazi Germany, right? At Nazi Germany, when things were really bad, there was an underground movement of people saying, we're going to follow God first, not the Third Reich. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a very strong proponent and saying of being outspoken against the government. It got him in a concentration camp and ended up dying right before the Allies liberated the camp. But they were saying, we have to speak the truth. We have to intervene. We have to pray. We have to be the people that God calls us to be, regardless of what political affiliations are. And so when the nation as a whole is going the wrong direction, and the nation as a whole is judged by God, there are good people within that nation that are also judged. Okay? That reap the consequences of the whole, the consequences of the nation. Not everybody, even under Ahab and Jezebel, are evil when the nation is going the wrong direction. Remember when Elijah was running, he had the wonderful victory at Mount Carmel, and the fire came down from heaven, and the people all yelled, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. And they turned away, and Jezebel said, you're going to be dead by this time tomorrow. And he runs for his life, and he's overwhelmed. He thinks he's alone. He thinks the big thing that happened with people declaring the Lord, he is God, they're just making a declaration, this is wonderful, but they're not really rooted in God, and he's about to die. And when God comes in and says, Elijah, what's the problem? He says, they've killed all the prophets, they're doing all these things, and I'm the only one who's left. Remember saying that? Have you ever felt that way where I'm the only one that's left? Folks, look around you. Look around. If you're at home, look at your phone. Reflection. You are not alone. One of the wonderful privileges we have of gathering together is to be reminded that we are not alone. And no matter what happens out there, God is true, and he has given us a family to be together, people to encourage us, to help us as we see difficult times, challenging times. We are not alone. God looks for those who are faithful and listen to him. Jesus did say in Matthew 24 that toward the end, the love of most people will grow cold. That is a startling indicator that we can watch for. When people stop loving others, only being interested in themselves, being selfish, not being respectful, enjoying rebellion. These are signs that in their love for others, their love for God, it grows cold. We must stand in the gap on behalf of our nation. Ezekiel 22:30 says this. God says, I looked for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land so that I would not have to destroy it, but I found none. Ezekiel stands and says, I'll be that man. And I believe in each generation, God calls us, men and women, to stand in the gap and say, I will pray for our nation. I will pray for our leaders, regardless of their political affiliation, whether they're tied with mine or not. I'm going to pray for them because they need God's leading. They need God to help them see, and even to make good choices when their heart would lead them to a different direction. But for God to be in control. Think about this. When God came to Abraham, and he was sending his angels down into Sodom and Gomorrah to look at the nation and, in effect, to save Lot out of that. You remember the bargaining that Abraham went back and forth? He said, God, are you going to wipe out the good with the bad? What if there are just 50 righteous people? All the rest of the people is bad, but if there's 50 righteous people, will you destroy the whole city? Will you destroy the righteous with the unrighteous? God said, no, if there's 50, I won't. Well, what if it's 5 less? What if it's 45? All right, it's 45. Oh, 40, right here, 40, 30, 30. Goes down to 10, okay? The divine auctioneer. And he's going back and forth, and he says, what if there's 10 righteous people? And he stops at that because he's like, surely there's 10 people in Sodom that are good. Well, there weren't. But what if there had been? Just 10 people. 10 people saying, I will serve God first. I will put his interests above mine. I will listen to him and I will speak for him no matter what happens outside. Now, Lot did that. Lot defended those that were defenseless. He brought in, at the cost of his own family, brought those angels in thinking they were men and protected them and was going to cause his own family personal injury to protect them. He was going to die too. And so God allowed the angels to work and intervene. But this is the point. If there had been 10 people who saw God's interest, God would have preserved the city. Because there was still a chance. Our nation is much bigger than the city of Sodom. I have no idea the size of what Sodom was at that point, or what the percentage of 10 was. I don't know if there were 100 people, if it was 10%. I have no idea. But I think the reason that America is preserved at this point is because there are some righteous people that have been following God and have been praying and interceding and asking for God's deliverance, for God's leading. It's up to us to continue that. We need to be a part of that, praying, God, not just to save us from total destruction. God, transform our hearts. God, help us as a nation to be the people that you blessed in the beginning, to be the people that you called to make a difference in this world. Final question on your outline is this. What is our purpose as a citizen of heaven as well as a citizen of the United States? And Jesus said that if the salt, we said we're the salt of the earth, but if the salt becomes saltless, if it loses its flavor, what good is it? It's good for nothing. It's going to be thrown out in the road and trampled underfoot. It's not good for anything. If you're not salty, don't do it. So what is our purpose? I came across a verse this week that I had found before and I had been looking for it. It's Acts 13. It's talking back in history through the life of King David. It said this, for when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep, meaning he died. He was buried with his fathers, and his body decayed. Now, we're not talking about the decay today, although there's a whole other sermon illustration there. At what point did David die? When he fulfilled his purpose. When he accomplished the purpose that God had placed him on the earth for, God said, it's enough. Are we accomplishing our purpose? The purpose that God has given us? Are we fulfilling that? Are we the salt that is helping the world to be preserved, to keep it from decaying? Or are we becoming more reflective of the world and becoming like the world and are good for nothing anymore except to be thrown out? Are we accomplishing our purposes? We are called to be ambassadors for God in this world. As citizens of this nation and citizens of heaven, we are called to stand for heaven and speak truth. And when we do, God will be with us, whatever happens. The closing song that Carlos chose for us was Another in the Fire. I asked the worship team to come forward. And it talks about how when we go through challenging situations, and the illustration is when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fire, there's someone there with them. Will you stand and pray for the nation? Will you stand in the gap and intervene? Will you be the person that God says, I need somebody, but I can't find anybody? Will you say, me, choose me. I'll be the one. I will pray. I will listen to you. I will stand in the gap. I will do what you want me to do. I will speak your voice. I will speak your truth. Lord, work through me. I surrender those areas in my life that may be faulty, those areas in my life that may be dark. I give them up. I want you and you only. I want to be a person that is a person after your heart. Will you be that kind of person? Will you say, yes, yes? Let's pray. Oh, Jesus, how we need you. It's a sad thing when we hear God say, I looked for someone who would stand in the gap and could find him. It's a sad thing when the salt has become saltless. I pray that you would bring us to the point of repentance, not just for us, but for the sins that our nation has perpetrated. There is good. There is still good. There are things that have happened. There are things we've done in the past. There are things that are going on in the present that are good. But there's a lot of injustice. And so we come to you right now and ask for you to intervene and start with us. That you will help us to be people of righteousness. People that can pray and intercede because you have restored us first. You help us to be intermediaries, stand in the gap for our nation. You would help us to hear your call to prayer, and that we would answer that call. Thank you for the freedoms we have. So many freedoms that we have that millions, billions around the world have never experienced. Help us use that freedom in a worthy manner. In Jesus' name.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be in this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire standing next to me. There was another in the wall holding back the seas. Should I ever be reminded of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears a burden that another died for me. There's another in the fire. Oh, oh, there's another in the fire. left dead beneath water. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning? Either way, I will bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. Was another in the fire standing next to me. Was another in the water holding back the sea. Should never be reminded. Power set me free. It's a prayer that holds no fire. And the power lives in me. It's another in the fire. Another in the fire. Oh, I can see the light in the darkness, and the darkness bows to him. Hear the roar of the heavens that space between where it's been. Hear the ground shake beneath us. Prison walls gave him. Nothing stands between. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He was and still is, will be through it all. So come with me in the space between all the things unseen and the reckoning. And I know I will never be alone. I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire standing next to me. There was another in the water holding back the stream. Should I ever need reminded? Good friends to me. I'm the joy from every battle. So that's where you'll be in the fire. Oh, there was another in the fire. Oh, I can see the light in the darkness, as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens, as the space between where still. Feel the ground shaking beneath us, as the prison walls give him. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. You may be seated. We do have a few announcements to share together today. We are still live streaming on Facebook, on YouTube, for our Friendly Fans page. If you are not on Facebook, you can see it on YouTube, but that's available for people. The youth will be meeting tonight, this afternoon, for a youth party from 2 until 7. 2 until 7. That'll be at the Harding's house. If you have teenagers that are wanting to be involved in that, talk to Carlos, and he can get you an address and directions if you don't know where that is. There is the women's breakfast is taking place on Saturday, July 25th, 8:30 a.m. in the fellowship hall. You can bring a dish of food and a friend, and you can share together, and they can have a good time with that. Thank you to our volunteers that have been working faithfully. They'll be coming in here a little bit and starting to clean, and they do that so that people in second service can have things taken care of, and we really appreciate that work. Trish Stebbins works hard during the week and getting things sterilized and taken care of, but she couldn't do that between services. It's not fair to ask her to do that either, because that's her job, and this is a place to worship on Sunday for her too. So
those volunteers that are coming in to make the difference between services are really benefiting. We appreciate that. And finally, starting on July the 19th, we're going to have the nursery and the preschool room opened. We are going to be opening on the 19th. Next week, for those that are wanting to be involved in that, there's some additional procedures that we're doing to make sure that everybody knows what's happening. And so the leadership team, the children will be meeting with you in the fellowship hall, I believe it is. Yeah, the fellowship hall, on all those updates and what we need to do as a result of that. And that'll be next week between services. So it'll be July the 12th. So the week before, you'll be able to know what's happening in the fall. So if there are other people in the fall, the following week on July 19th. So if you are interested in being involved in that and helping us, we have lost a few workers because of that, that we weren't aware of. So if you were able to help in that way, we would invite you to do so. Now, again, for children, that will just be second service, the 10:45 service, for just the nursery and the preschool room. Okay. We do have the Wednesday night Being the Bridge that Rachel Gillens is leading. That started off this week. If you were able to, I wasn't able to be here this week, but I'm planning to come this coming Sunday. Wow, my words are getting all messed up today. I was able to be here this past Wednesday, but this coming Wednesday I'm planning to be there. And I think it was a great start they had. I've heard some things about that. I do want to be involved. It's not too late if you haven't been able to be a part of that. And you want to join, it's not too late, but do let Rachel know so she can be aware of people are coming and we can have the space setting for enough people when you arrive. Okay. Let's stand together for closing prayer. Jesus, thank you for your faithfulness, for your love, for your goodness that goes through all generations. Thank you for the freedoms that we have. And we ask that you would lead us to be the people that you're called from darkness to light. In Jesus' name. Amen.
No.